welcome to the Skiffy Fanny Show's SF at School.
Mortician, the last one to put a smile on your face.
That is technically accurate, and kind of, yeah.
It honestly makes me feel a little uncomfortable sometimes, when I'm embalming women especially, because having somebody to tell me to smile when I'm dead?
Yeah, that's creepy.
That's a bit much, yeah. Well, I'm Shaun.
I'm Daniel.
So on today's show, we're talking to a very special guest about mortuary arts, and I'm told necromancy is going to come up, so we may talk about some necromancy, and that is SFF author Amanda Downum. Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, this could be fun.
Thanks,
I have some weird questions. Not really. They're probably only weird because they're questions you wouldn't ask anybody else. That makes sense.
Yeah, to be curious to see like which ones. It's like, oh, I've heard these all before. So Amanda is the author of the Necromancer Chronicles trilogy, for which she's been nominated for the Galactic Spectrum Award, the David Gemmell Award, and the James Tiptree Jr. Award. She's also written Dreams of Shreds and Tatters, The Poison Court, and the World Fantasy Award-nominated collection, Still So Strange.
In 2019, she decided to step beyond armchair necromancy to start mortuary school, and she's now a licensed mortician.
Congratulations.
I'm going to have a question about that later, just so you know.
Well, before we get to those questions for Amanda, a reminder to our listeners and viewers to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't there already, join us on Twitch for Shaun's Alphabet streams every Friday at 7 p.m. Central Time to be part of our interactive live streaming format. And finally, be sure to join our Patreon and be part of our Torture Cinema polls, live watches, and other special Patreon-only events and releases, or on Discord and on podcast. And it only takes a single slim $1 bill a month to be a part of our Patreon.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start with what are my silly questions, which is just taking the first beginning of a question word and then just sticking whatever the subject is, and then you can answer them however you would like. Some of them are kind of obvious, and then others might be less so. So the first one is the kind of obvious one, which is what is a mortician?
So, mortician is the more modern, replaced the term undertaker when the field was trying to move out of, creepy embalming in your own basement, presenting itself as, a grown-up, non-scary profession. And being a mortician can either mean that you are a funeral director, an embalmer, or both. You can do either separately as a profession, or you can do both, depending on your personal preferences. But either of those would fall under the umbrella of mortician.
Okay. So then the next question is, why a mortician?
The short answer is because I'm a goth and a weird kid. The longer answer is that, which will tie into the how, but I was, by 2018, I had sort of hit a kind of creative burnout, some day job stagnation, was really looking for a new avenue, other than working retail, which is a little soul-crushing. And that is when I discovered how you become a mortician. And when I discovered the how, Hosannas of Angels began to sing, and I was like, oh, I could do this too. Holy crap.
Well, then with that in mind, how does one become a mortician?
It is an associate's degree. Or you get an associate's degree and then you have to pass a national licensing exam. But I had always sort of assumed that it must be either you came from a family-owned funeral home and you were just sort of born into it, 6 feet under sort of thing. You'd grown up with it, or maybe you had to go to medical school, or it was something like becoming a medical examiner. And so I had always assumed, like, oh, that's clearly out of reach. And then I discovered that no, it is actually an associate's degree. Not that difficult comparatively, depending on what your personal academic strengths or weaknesses might be, and your maybe tolerance for bad smells. And once I discovered that there was a program within commuting distance of where I lived at the time, it was like, you know what, we're going for it.
So are there different programs if you want to do the embalming and sort of everything, or just want to do bits and pieces? Or is it you just enter in a program and then later you kind of get certified for one or the...
There is a national exam that you have to pass to be licensed. Schooling very much varies by state. Every state's requirements are slightly different. And so the answer is it depends. But yes, like where I am teaching right now, we offer either the full associate's degree, you do the arts and the sciences, you learn the embalming part and the directing part, and then once you're licensed, pursue whatever, follow your heart out in the field. But if you go in knowing that you do not want to touch dead bodies, I always say why, then why are you in this field? Yes. But there is an option to go in and just get a certification to become a funeral director if you do not want to do the embalming side. And there are perfectly good reasons why people would not want to do that. So I do understand.
Right. But professionally, you could have a job where you're actively doing both sides of things.
Yes.
Okay.
So from a skills perspective, if you were to just split them in two, you have one which is sort of medical field related in terms of handling of bodies themselves, which I assume has some certain technical requirements. But then the other, where you're more the director role, seems to me much more almost like in the psychiatric field almost, where it's much more people oriented. But maybe I'm misunderstanding, and so maybe you could kind of explain like the skill deviation if one chooses like one path over the other.
Working as a director, I tend to use restaurant terminology, like front of house or back of house. But yeah, working front of house is very much, you are dealing with people. You are sitting down with families, you are helping them make arrangements, you're planning services, it's a little bit of a grief counselor, it's a little bit of an event coordinator, it's a lot of paperwork. And it is a very complicated job. There are a lot of wheels moving, a lot of cogs. It is not something I have ever been interested in. I knew from the minute that I entered school and started my lab classes that I wanted to do the embalming side. And I have been lucky enough that I was able to specialize in that way. And it's definitely not as rigorous as pursuing an actual medical degree, but there is a lot of anatomy, pathology, microbiology, all of that very fun stuff, which I love. I am a nerd for that kind of stuff, so it worked out well for me.
So as in this realm, I want to ask any questions that are actually about like the handling of the bodies in a respectful manner, given that we are talking about people's loved ones in general. I'm kind of curious about, like, I have the idea of what this process is like when obviously you receive someone's remains, but like what's a decent how would you break down kind of from the moment of receipt to like the end process from your side of the work? What does that all kind of look like? Obviously not literally every single step if there are quite a lot. Yeah.
So generally speaking, and I'm speaking about funeral home embalming, because there are other things like you can do, anatomical donation, things like that. If you have donated your body to science, there are different trajectories. But speaking just as a funeral embalmer, what happens is someone dies, their family calls the funeral home. The funeral home sends out someone, hopefully multiple someones, but someone, the job title ends up being things like transfer specialist or removal technician or something like that, assuming that you're dealing with a larger business and it's not, someone where there is actually a funeral director who is on call 24 hours a day. But assuming you're at a larger facility where you have staff, then they will send out the transfer team to take the body into the care of the funeral home. And again, yes, we are talking about someone's loved one. We are talking about a former human being, in all of the ways that I think matter. We are always obviously trying to treat this person with respect, with dignity, with care. It is also just comedy. You can't really survive in the industry if you can't laugh at yourself and at the situations that you find yourself in. So everybody has the removal horror stories. And again, it's never anything negative against families, right? It's just, we have to laugh at these situations to stay sane for the most part.
Yeah, it's like gallows humor. If you're in really dark situations, you kind of need the release a little bit. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I very much always want to provide the most respectful care possible, both for the decedent themselves and to their family, but also there is some slapstick that is going to happen every time you are trying to wrangle a dead body. It's there is just a lot of ridiculousness. But after the wrangling and the comedy, which hopefully there's no comedy, hopefully everything works very smoothly. We look very professional the entire time. We take the decedent back to the funeral home, and from there, it sort of just depends on what the family wants. Occasionally, that's going to be embalming, and the dressing and the casketing and the full public visitation, the sort of traditional funeral. Sometimes it's direct cremation. Sometimes it's leaving a person in a cooler for way too long while we're trying to get paperwork sorted out. Yeah, there are many things that can happen. And sometimes bureaucracy can occasionally bite us in the butt.
So are you also dealing with bodies that have people that have been deceased through unnatural causes? Or does that get handled separately? Do you ever have to show up at a crime scene and pick up?
That again varies a lot by state and sometimes even county or jurisdiction within a state. I, until very recently, was based out of Texas, and specifically Austin. And where I was in Texas, the Austin medical examiner, that county's medical examiner, took their job very seriously. If there were any concerns, if the person did not have a doctor who's going to sign their death certificate, if there was any question at all as to how they died, if they had been found, if they were, an indigent person who hadn't been seeing a doctor, things like that, the medical examiner would get involved. So that was a situation where my funeral home would pick up a lot of bodies from the medical examiner, but we did not go to crime scenes.
Okay.
Occasionally, you would get things like, say, someone dies at home unexpectedly, the police show up, the paramedics show up, the medical examiner would get called, but they would look at the case and they would say, okay, you know, this person had been treated for a heart condition. Nothing looked weird. This all looks like natural causes. We're going to release it. Where I am now, it seems like it's still weirding me out. It's a culture shock how many fewer autopsies I deal with out here, and how just really blasé the medical examiners seem to be. And I'm not not trying to throw any shade. It's just definitely fewer autopsies where I am now, and the medical examiners are far more likely to release, and the term natural causes covers a wide array of things. And I personally, I mean, yes, many things, being eaten by a bear is natural causes. I'd still like to know a little bit more about the circumstances by which someone got eaten by a bear. So I have not yet I have been to a couple of probable crime scenes when someone had been released, but apparently that is something that happens much more often where I am now in Virginia than where I was in Texas. So,
well, to bounce off that question, I kind of already know the answer to this, but others may not, right? In the different circumstances of one's death, there may be the natural causes, which it may be, in your perspective, comes with less complications than in terms of the presentation. Because I assume in your line of work, it is not to just simply embalming and then they just go into the ground. Some people want to see the deceased, and if you're dealing with unnatural causes, like a car accident, for example, there may be difficulties now of how do we make that person essentially presentable. And so I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like, well, the complexities of trying to deal with that in your expertise, like what kind of goes into dealing with those more difficult rather than more straightforward cases?
Dental floss. Lots and lots of dental floss.
Huh.
But specifically in cases of trauma, say someone was in a car accident, or say someone was shot or something in the head, and say something happened that caused a lot of facial trauma, and we are now reconstructing the face as best we can. Yes, we are doing a lot of very, very fine suture work with dental floss.
When you try to, I'm really curious, because you're using, I assume, the dental floss because it's fairly thin and can be easily masked.
It's very thin. It's, waxed. Mostly it's just very, very thin. Normally we're using, much larger ligature, the kind that's designed, say someone were, autopsied and we're stitching up a Y incision, and the important thing there is that it needs to be leak proof. But the person will be wearing clothes over it. No one's going to be seeing that stitch work. Whereas if we have to do some sort of restoration in basically the face, but a visible part of the body, then we want our stitches to be as tiny as possible and hopefully able to be covered with cosmetics.
Okay. In doing these sort of, you use the word reconstructions, which I suppose an aspect of this is then you're looking at photographs of them when they were alive, and to the best of your ability trying to approximate their look. That to me suggests like a level of artistry that is not just merely like stitching, right?
Yes. And I have to just say, if we're lucky, we're looking at photos To all of our listeners, oh my goodness, if you have to arrange a funeral for anyone, please provide recent photos. It is a great gripe in the industry of we receive photos from the family of someone, like their wedding photos from 50 years ago, their high school graduation photo from 1962. It looks very nice at the service. More difficult using that as a guideline for someone who is like, say, 85 years old when they died. It's one of my professional peeves. But yes, if we are lucky, we have photos. And now, because of social media, if there is always someone at every funeral home who can find photos of anyone online. There is always the Facebook stalker who will get on there and find photos of people. This person is invaluable. It is not me. I'm not that good. But yes, so we're trying to find a recent photo, and then yes, trying to approximate just symmetry and, face shape and general, like if they wore makeup or if they styled their hair or things like that. And yes, in any funeral services or mortuary science degree, one of the final classes will be restorative arts. And it is a very intensive class. You will learn more than you ever thought possible about facial bones and facial muscles and how to, and I will say not everybody 20 years later in the field remembers all of those muscles, but we do at least have to learn them all. Just the skeletal structure of the face, how the muscles play over that, sort of like which muscles do what, the sort of like the canon of beauty, right? So the general like proportions that are considered normal for human faces, color theory, like it is a lot. And some embalmers are better at it than others, as with anything. And I don't even mean that as like again, not trying to throw shade. It is difficult. And there are absolutely cases where there is just not a whole lot that we can do.
Right.
That would be my last follow-up before, Daniel, you can jump in, which would be in those situations where, suturing and some use of cosmetics really can't do the trick. What does an embalmer essentially do to try, like, are there tricks to kind of, like, do you use other, like, plaster, or is there other bits, other things we do that to try to bring back a face that looks more like a face, essentially?
Wax is the number one. But yeah, at a certain part, pardon me, as my brain is just sort of leaking down at the back of my throat. But yes, with a certain degree of trauma, instead of just reconstructing the bones and the skin, we are sculpting essentially a new face out of wax. Which is, again, not an easy thing at all. It's one of those things I would love more practice at it, but also that sounds terrible because no, I don't want more opportunities to practice because more people have died in terrible accidents, but I would definitely like to improve my professional skill set.
I can ask more questions, but like Daniel please.
So two came up that are unrelated, I guess, from what you were saying and what Shaun was asking. One is, do the families or friends or whoever, is closest to the deceased, do they ever have an opportunity, or would you even want them to have an opportunity for feedback prior to game time, as it were, of like the display of the corpse in a funeral, of the body in the funeral? And then the other question I had was whether there was are there set cosmetics that are kind of like the go-to that are like specialized, I guess, cosmetics, particularly for the art that one has to do in that reconstruction, or is it just the same as any cosmetic people would be using in day-to-day life?
So the answer is yes to both. And it obviously, when it comes to viewings and visitations and families giving feedback, it varies a lot. But often, especially families that have, I guess, a tradition of having those public services. So again, like my personal family background, we go for a lot of cremation. I never attended funerals as a child, but I also know a lot of people where that's the expectation that when a family member dies, there will be a large gathering and a public service. And for those families, I find I've met a lot of people, and I've seen a lot of people where they will come in and want to view beforehand, and they will have opinions. Sometimes the opinions are positive, sometimes they're negative, sometimes there are things that we can change or fix, and sometimes there are things that are beyond our control at that point. A lot of families like to bring in their own cosmetics. A lot of families like to have people come in and do the makeup of the deceased themselves. So, and as far as makeup, yes, there are special mortuary makeups. And whether or not you have to use those or you can use, like, go to the drugstore, it really depends on the body and the embalming process, whatever conditions were present in the body. Were there things that we had to, like, were there medical conditions we had to deal with, things like that? I don't know. Did you ever see the movie Death Becomes Her?
I have not, no. I remember the trailers, that's all.
So in that movie, Bruce Willis's character is, he's a plastic surgeon who becomes an undertaker. And there's one point in the movie where someone makes a comment about his work as a mortician and how, nice someone looked in the casket. And he goes on this drunken tirade or rant about, like, oh no, you can't just use ordinary makeup. You have to, like, the tissues are not right for that anymore. And it's played for comedy, but it's actually, like, fairly accurate. Because again, assuming that we're talking about traditional embalming, we're using formaldehyde. Formaldehyde dehydrates tissues and it fixes them. So it's firming the tissue. So in a lot of cases, you cannot use just an ordinary, like, drugstore makeup. You need something more like stage makeup, something like a heavier cream-based makeup. So yeah, we have a lot of those. One of the secrets is many times when families bring in cosmetics, like, we will always accept them, but sometimes we can't use them and we have to just color match. Because the product that someone used when they were alive is no longer going to be appropriate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm really glad you brought up... go ahead, please.
I was going to say, cosplay tutorials have actually helped me. Cosplay tutorials and just general, like, the advent of everyone having a makeup channel on YouTube. But because cosplay has to do such heavy makeup and such, very sometimes solid color, a lot of that contouring where you're trying to completely change the perceived shape of your face, and they're trying to keep it on for, say, like a 5-hour photo shoot or something. And so serious cosplayers have a lot of tricks to how to get your makeup to stay even and not crease and not crack. And those can come in very, very handy.
Oh, interesting. So there's a fandom connection. Excellent.
Yes.
One of the questions you kind of leading me right down this path, because you're mentioning, a film in which there is a scene where one talks about your profession. And I was curious about, from your perspective as someone in the profession, what are some of the most common mistakes that people make in trying to represent what you actually do in your work.
Definitely. I mean, as far as just representing death itself in the media, and I mean, I understand, obviously, you're not bringing out an actual dead body. Most of what makes me roll my eyes now when I'm watching movies or TV is just everyone looks so pretty when they die. And it's always, if their eyes are open, they're open evenly, and someone just comes in and very gracefully closes the eyes and then they stay closed, which that is not accurate. And maybe, usually, if a female character has died, their mouth might be slightly open and they might have a little drop of blood at the corner, but it's always, they just look very pale and tragic, and their makeup is flawless. No one has ever, peed themselves. No one has ever, voided bowels. No one has ever vomited in death. There's never any of the just unfortunate, gross side effects of having a flesh suit, as we go through the world. And I understand that, again, most, say we're just doing a police drama or something, they're not trying to gross out their audience. But at a certain point, I'm like, oh, everyone's makeup is perfect forever, all the time. And everyone dies. No one dies in the bathroom, for the most part, on television. There's never the, oh no, they have wedged themselves into the most awkward place possible. Oh dear.
I love that you bring up the police procedural, because, if you think about the CSI effect, which is the way that the public now has this perception that the police have the most sophisticated forensics technology, and they could get a fingerprint just by having super AI lasers look at a wall or whatever, right? There's this sort of perception that's created, and you're kind of talking about a very similar thing, which I think actually has a very similarly damaging effect in a way. Maybe not in a really horrific way, but in the sense that these shows are showing the deceased, as you say, in a very pretty light, and death is sometimes, frankly, not very pretty. It's sometimes messy, and so in a way, we're sort of being deprived of kind of preparation, as it were, for that moment when, you do find your loved one has passed, or, and you have to now experience what death is really like. And in some cases that could, I imagine, be rather traumatic. Would be I would feel like that could be quite traumatic.
Yeah, and I will say one of, you may be familiar with Caitlin Doty, Ask a Mortician, and I love a lot of her work. I love her books. She's a wonderful writer. I get into arguments with her in my head frequently. So we have very similar views on a lot of things, and then just occasionally she'll say something, and I'm like, why would you? No, that's not. But she's a big advocate of things like home funerals, and sort of that taking death away from this the corporate funeral home sort of thing, back sort of think of the 1800s. If someone died and there would be a viewing held at their home before they were taken to church for the service and then to the burial, etc. The family was much more involved in bathing and dressing the deceased, things like that. And again, I am a big advocate of that where it is appropriate and where the family wants that. And I do absolutely think that, especially in America, we don't have a great understanding of death, and it's very culturally taboo to a lot of people, and to the point where families don't want to discuss it. And it's going to happen, of course, to everybody, and it's much better if you can talk about it with your kids or your parents or whoever, the people who are going to have to make those arrangements for you. But also, because a lot of people do, in fact, die in hospitals undergoing medical treatment, And a lot of that is not pleasant, and it leaves very unfortunate effects on the body. And you can't just say, like, oh yes, everybody can have a home funeral. Like, no, there are a lot of bodies that were really, really not suited to be taken home for a viewing. It's, as much as I want families to have options and to understand what their rights are and to not get taken advantage of, but I also would like people to understand that, like, no, sometimes you really do need professionals to step in and handle things. Like, there are reasons that people are trained to handle the dead and care for the dead.
I would
in
imagine
the 1800s, you dropped over dead of a heart attack and were at home.
Yeah.
And weren't at the hospital then going under treatments. And yeah.
Well, I totally get what you're saying. I would imagine that there are some incredibly unpleasant complications that can come out of the condition of one's body upon death that could even make, like, trying to have a home viewing frankly deeply unpleasant. I'm trying to be very delicate, but I hope people understand where I'm getting at. Like, yes, it dawns on me that, like, death has a smell, essentially. And it is very tough. If you've ever been, like, around, I imagine Paul's in chat, so he's probably had this experience, but, like, a deer has died in the woods, but has been out there in the sun all day or something, and you get that smell, and that must be, I suspect, like, a lot of people just don't smell that often enough and that intensity that they fully comprehend, like, if a body's not, as you're pointing out, kind of treated in a very certain way, like, it could really make having like a family moment essentially with the deceased very difficult.
Yes, and I am an embalmer, and I do really, really, really love my job, and just the art and the science of it is, like, I could just nerd out forever. But also, I am in no way saying that, embalming is the best thing all the time. Like, absolutely not. It is very much a personal choice for, every person, every family, and it is absolutely legal, possible, and fine to do many, many, many types of funeral services without embalming. Again, so there are obviously, like, Jewish families, Muslim families, their religion does not embalm. And they will usually have, a ritual bathing performed either by, like, the family members or by the religious community, things like that. And that is, I think that's very sweet. And I always really appreciate that when the family comes in and cares for their loved ones. It's just honestly very respectful and touching. And I have seen so many, more just, like, stereotypical white American families where they just have that remove, where they just don't know how to talk about death, and they don't really want to look at it, and they don't, like, they just want to kind of shut down and not engage with it. And I am not a psychologist, but that never seems to me like the healthier option. But so, again, I just do think that no matter what your wishes are or your family traditions, it is helpful when you can talk to professionals who will say, like, yes, we can absolutely do X or Y or Z for you. And this is, you don't have to pay for this thing or that thing or whatever. And of course, we don't have to do chemical embalming, but let us bathe your loved one. Let us clean up, like, were they in the hospital? Did they have 20 IVs in them? Like, let us take care of these things. So I understand why people get so upset with modern corporate funeral tradition, funeral business, because it is ridiculously expensive and it seems very exploitative sometimes. Even though, like, there are laws in place to make it less so. But yeah, it is definitely not a great situation for families to be in.
Particularly when they're not culturally used to or prepared for dealing with it. And yeah, being able to talk about it or go through that, yeah. So during your education and experiences, was there something that really surprised you that you hadn't realized or hadn't expected going into things? And then I guess the other question on the other end would be whether what is it about the science that you kind of find the coolest?
I mean, to the first part of that question, yes. Can I think of those things now? Of course not.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I mean, definitely there were some little things, just because, again, like, my family does not have a, tradition of funerals, right? It's usually like someone dies, they disappear and get cremated. And that's that. So when I first actually started going into embalming labs and actually like putting my hands on dead bodies for the first time, there were definitely things where I was like, oh, I did not think it would be like this, because I had only been reading descriptions in books or seeing them in movies. So definitely lots of little things that surprised me. And occasionally some of you'll trip over the occasional like weird legal thing or something, like, again, because every state has different licensure requirements and different laws in place. So occasionally you'll see something and be like, what happened for this weirdly specific law, because something always happened.
Yes.
But as far as like what I think, it's all so cool. I guess the easiest answer is the restorative process, both in, like, if we're talking about serious trauma reconstruction, which I love, even though your hands will be cramping for days after some of these things, but just the things that embalming can do to just, and we're not making a person look alive again. Like, it's nothing at all like that. The person is dead and there's no confusion, but just the difference, the physical cosmetic difference that an embalmer can make. And especially like when you see someone who had been ill for a very long time and just obviously or especially when then you see a photo, right? You see the photo of them 15 years ago, and then you see what they looked like after they had been dealing with an illness. And when you can sort of get them looking more like, I guess, themselves again, I don't know. I personally just find that very rewarding. It just, to me, I just like the idea of someone caring for me one last time, even if I'm not around in any kind of, conscious way to know about it. It just seems very sweet to me. So I always like it when I can try to do that for someone else. But also just the chemistry of it is amazing. And I don't even have a very strong chemistry background. Like, I got an English degree in undergrad and was scared of math. And so now, as I'm trying to learn about peptide bonds and protein fixation, and so I have a learning curve, but it is so cool.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the English degree, because one of the other related subjects, and part of the reason we do like SF at school, is to think about its use and implications in fiction, and in your case, necromancy is a thing that we could, of course, talk about, and I kind of want to eventually get into that. But if we could maybe start from your views more in a general sense of kind of what being knowledgeable in this can bring to the design of worlds, or to science fiction, or to fantasy, like in a broad sense of like how it helps you think about the characters and the worlds that you're sort of developing as a writer.
Yes, I mean, I definitely, when I started in mortuary school, my first thought was like, this is so neat. I have to tell all my writer friends about all of this cool stuff. And then also, like, I think writers, at least my writing group, tends to joke a lot about, like, you know, all of our search history and like the poor NSA agent who's reading our writers chat all the time. And so I started the Ask a Necromancer column over at the Deadlands because I was like, this is so cool. I want to tell people how cool it is. And then eventually I just started teaching, and now I get to like trap kids in classrooms. And, let me tell you how cool this is. But yeah, but like even more broadly, I do think there's just, because even though like I love to geek out about the science side, right? And the physicality of dead bodies and how we're handling them. But there is this cultural side of how do cultures handle, how do they care for their dead? Like if you're building a world, right? Like how do your characters feel about death? Do they have like cultural traditions, family traditions? Like is there literal necromancy? Like, can they literally speak to the spirits of their ancestors? You know, is their best friend now a ghost who's following them around on adventures? Or is it more like you don't know? Sort of the constant question that I think most humans, a lot of people have like strong beliefs, but I think also a lot of us are just sort of like I don't know what is going to happen. So I think that's really fascinating to explore. And I've been sort of working on some more science fictional projects recently. And some of the cool things there is like trying to think of, okay, now you're not only you're building a world from scratch, but you have now technology at play. So how does this culture handle their dead? You know, it's not, we have more options now than just burial, cremation. You know, it's my big thing is because right now human composting is becoming legal in some states. Mm-hmm. And there's also alkaline hydrolysis, which I'm super, super fascinated by. But basically the combination of these things would allow you to make these amazing like funeral gardens where you can compost bodies and then use the nitrogenous rich fluid that's left over from alkaline hydrolysis as fertilizer. And, you know, so I like thinking about things like that. Like, what is this culture going to do with death, and how are they going to treat death?
Well, there is another question that I suppose we need to ask now, because you raised a bunch of stuff that like broke my brain. But, you know, the one I kind of get, like human composting, like I understand what composting, and so I get the concept. But you said some other thing about some fancy sciencey word. And so this is kind of part of the question of like, what's the future developments in this field? I suppose that you'll have to explain to me what that fancy science word is. But then if
alkaline
you can,
hydrolysis.
Don't start with me, Daniel. Okay. But if you can also, in addition to that, kind of speculate, I guess, about what you see as the future of your profession. Like, what's it going to look like in, I don't know, 25 years or 100, or, you know, what kind of weirdness is coming down the pipeline, you think?
I am super curious about that. And I definitely hope, because again, like I am an advocate for green burial. Even though there's so many cool things you can do when you're embalmed. But yes, but green burial I'm a big fan. And then that's just obviously being usually like not even in a casket, just like a shroud or a little wicker basket being buried and immediately allowed to decompose, which I think is a perfectly good way to go. And then there is now, again, human composting, which is, again, it's much more, you're not just immediately planted in the ground decomposing. You're in a little pod and they're in there turning you like compost, which to me seems like a lot. It's if I'm dead, just let me decompose. Like, please don't come in there every so often and like poke me with a pitchfork.
You gotta aerate that.
I'm sorry, that's the image you painted in my head is just really morbidly funny. Just like a big tube with a body roll. Like, I'm sorry. That's just, I just find that deeply amusing.
But I want these things, and I alkaline hydrolysis is so cool to me. But I want these things to catch on. And there's right now there's a lot of pushback. I mean, again, with any industry, every time there's anything new, there's always a period of like I'm pretty sure this is any single like medicine or, you know, technology, even writing, like what, you know, when self-publishing first started to appear on the horizon, the way some people were like, oh God, no, never, never. But especially in funeral services where there's even more, I feel, some of that weight to the tradition and you get a lot of pushback. So every time there is some new technology introduced, you get a lot of people who are like, I don't know, we don't know how that works, we don't trust it. But I think we're good. Like, we are not actually... I mean, there could be a zombie outbreak. I don't actually know. But it's not going to be human composting that gives us zombies. So I really hope that these things do catch on and they become options. Because especially, I think, as we're getting, you know, younger generations are now becoming adults and with families and, you know, starting to think about what they are going to do when they die. And assuming, you know, that I think a lot of them just sort of assume that the world will have burned down by the time they're adults and they won't have to worry about it. But I would definitely like to see the industry shaken up a little bit, where instead of being like, no, we can do burial or cremation and that's it, where more funeral homes will be like working with families and trying to figure out options and let them do things that are meaningful to them. You can have your cremated remains launched into space. And I'm generally opposed to things that are like stupidly expensive, but that's really cool.
I don't know, man. That's like, at least like have like one of those like little plaques that the aliens get to see later also go up with you. You know, because then at least, like, you didn't spend all that money just to send, you know, my, like, carbon bits into space.
But then who knows what the aliens are going to do with you either, so... They
could resurrect me. They could be necro...
Yeah, it could be like Spock, right?
What are they called in Chronicles of Riddick? Are they called, like, necromongers in that, right? That's like, he went to the nether realm and, like, came back a god or whatever they said, and like he's half alive, his soul is like half detached from his body.
That always annoyed me because they weren't selling death as like words mean things. I feel like there should have been more like, you know, a sales pitch involved of like, yes, this is death, here's today's catch, this is what we have to offer.
No, they were offering propaganda and like extreme aversion therapy. Like that's basically what they were offering. Not nice guys. I don't know why they just kill everybody. That's how they get their converts. So
that works for a lot of groups, though. So you know, why reinvent the wheel?
So if you're willing to say after your experiences in doing this now, what are your, like, have your preferences changed to what you want to have done after your death? Or is it still pretty much the same as you had felt prior?
I can think of like a dozen things. Some of them are, I cannot yet. Like, I adore Tibetan sky burial. Which, if you're not familiar with it, this is where a body is not just placed out on a mountain, but like actually they will go in and dismember and disjoint you and chop you up into pieces that are easily consumed by the vultures or the wildlife, and then put you on a platform on a mountain. And I love vultures, and I would be happy to be eaten by vultures. Nowhere in America are you allowed to chop up a body and put it out on a platform for the buzzards legally.
Not yet.
I think the closest you can get in America right now is to donate your body to a body farm, where at least, different critters will get to eat you, just less dramatically. And that is also great. Right now, I am kind of leaning toward donating my body to science, and hopefully that I could specify that they could give me to an embalming school, and so that I get the next generation of little baby embalmers would get to practice on me someday.
That's nice.
That's nice. I mean, I scientific donation, bodily donation, and even just like organ and tissue donation is really great. I mean, there are so many things that are done with either the whole body or the bits and pieces of the body that can be harvested when someone dies. And it does actually contribute to a lot of different medical fields. So it is pretty cool. And so I think if you can donate your body to science, that is kind of awesome.
I agree.
For science.
I don't want to leave this on the table because I said I was going to ask you about necromancy, and we don't have a lot of time left, so I have to ask about the necromancy. Why? What's your deal with the necromancy stuff?
So okay, this is when I was like maybe 8. My mother read The Lord of the Rings to me. Obviously this is like why I am the way I am, but in there, like, one of the terms used to refer to Sauron is the necromancer. And that's just like in passing, like somebody mentions it once. I was not reading the Silmarillion when I was 8. No. But so like that word just sort of was in my head at a very early age. And I like, looked it up eventually. It was like, okay, that's okay. Like magic using the dead or divination using the dead. Cool. And then I started encountering it more and more as I was reading more fantasy fiction. And I'm like, this is really neat. And at a certain point, I got really, really frustrated because necromancers in fiction were always evil. Like, it was always this horrible, like, the worst type of magic. And why? And that started to bother me a lot of, like, why is this so evil inherently? Because death is natural, and so that eventually, like, informed my Necromancer Chronicles. But yeah, it's Tolkien's fault. That is his fault that I fixated on that word when I was a small child.
Well, that's really interesting to me, because you're not wrong. You're completely right that, like, necromancers are always, like, associated with as the bad, like, they're not good. Necromancers are bad. And I feel like that's not fair, because they're mostly bad because they play around with death and death-related things. But, like, that's not inherently, like, everything dies eventually. That's just, like, it's just nature. It's just inherently what it is. So, like, I just feels, like, weirdly prejudicial, like, against necromancers.
I get it. Like, yes, if your neighbor is raising a zombie army every week, sure. I understand how this could be frustrating. But I always like felt like there were much broader applications of necromancy. And it was actually Laurel K. Hamilton and the Anita Blake books, which I read when I was in high school. She has a forensic necromancer. And when I encountered that, I was like, yes, that's genius. Because why wouldn't you? If you could summon the spirits of the dead to answer questions. And I have, some issues with that series in general, but I thought it was pretty realistic. Like, yes, this character can reanimate the dead and have them answer questions. And so people are always like contesting wills and like just it's all of this, the petty little human stuff that happens in courts, but now happening with dead people. And I was like, okay, that actually seems pretty realistic.
That's exciting. It's pretty fun. Okay, well, we got to wrap up. I'm sure there's like 1,000 more questions we could ask, but I want to make sure that we say a massive, huge thank you to you, Amanda, for coming on and talking about your profession and necromancy. And I think we'll be starting a petition to change the public perception of necromancers, that they're really the heroes all along. But thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. So for folks at home... go ahead.
Oh, may I plug?
Yes, please do.
Oh, yes, please.
So, because I do have the Ask a Necromancer column in the Deadlands, and everyone should read the Deadlands because it's wonderful, great fiction and poetry. But there is a portal on our website where you can submit your questions. So if anyone listening right now has death-related questions, please submit them over there, and they will eventually get answered in one of our upcoming issues.
If you just go to deadlands.com, you'll find it there. I'm sure if you Google Deadlands Ask a Necromancer, it'll probably come up in a Google search too. Yeah, but we'll put a link in our show notes for folks to find it that way too. So, perfect. Okay, so folks at home, thank you for being here. We're going to wrap the show up. So if you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode or make a suggestion, there are two ways to do that, skiffingfanty@gmail.com, or we have our listener suggestion form, which is skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions. We're on most of the socials, not on the bad place. We're probably mostly now on Blue Sky would be our primary, but you can find all of the social places where we're active on our Linktree, as well as our newsletter and our Patreon and all of those things. And that's linktr.ee/skiffyandfanty. Me, I can be found at ShaunDuke.net. I'm Alphabet Streams here, presently just doing Skiffy and Fanty, but probably doing other stuff later. So Alphabet Streams on Twitch, Fridays at 7 p.m. for Skiffy stuff. I have a Patreon, and I'm on Blue Sky and all those places. I'm either Shaun Duke or Grand Moff Duke or Grand Admiral Duke, but my Linktree is just /Shaun Duke.
You can find me at reading1000lives.com, my blog, and I'm also at reading1000lives on Blue Sky, and 1000 is the numeral, so 1000. And where can people find you, Amanda?
I am still so strange at Blue Sky right now, and I am on Facebook for my sins, just Amanda Downum, and I will be there. It's so hard to leave. And that's mostly it right now for the socials. My website has so many cobwebs on it. You should not trust anything you might find there. And of course, at the Deadlands.
Perfect. As is required in the Skiffy Fanty bylaws, I must now make it awkward. And so pretty much nobody knows this, but this entire time, Daniel is not the real Daniel. He is, in fact, a Daniel I built out of random bacteria I stole from his lab and then brought to life during the thunderstorms in Iowa that were a couple of months ago. And so for 2 months now, every Daniel you've interacted with is this weird bacteria creature Daniel. The other Daniel I've been keeping in the basement.
No one knows the difference. No one
Aren't
can
we
tell.
all really
We're all
weird
just-
bacteria colonies anyway?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
They're with
true.
us even after death. Even after we're dead, we're still just sacks of bacteria.
Sounds delicious. Well, on that note, awkward ending and scene.